How does a monarch build one of the most heavily armed, seemingly invincible states in the entire Middle East, only to watch it completely unravel in a matter of months? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're mapping the incredibly complex trajectory of Mohammad Reza Shah's rule right from 1953 all the way to the late 1970s. We're going to explore his massive domestic consolidation of power and his, quite frankly, aggressive geopolitical strategies. If you really want to understand the roots of modern Iran, the Cold War dynamics of the Middle East, and the spectacular collapse of the Pahlavi dynasty, this is the period you absolutely have to master. Let's get into it.
Here is our agenda for today's explainer. We'll be looking at consolidating the autocratic state, the White Revolution, the Petroleum rentier state, social tensions and inequality, and finally, the Nixon Doctrine.
Okay, to kick things off and challenge the common misconception that the Shah was just some American puppet, we have to start with this startling 1972 quote from President Nixon. Literally, he said, "Protect me." Nixon said this directly to the Shah in Tehran. Now, to understand why the leader of the free world was asking a Middle Eastern monarch for protection, you really have to look at the geopolitical reality of 1972. The U.S. was deeply bogged down in the Vietnam War, they were facing intense anti-war protests at home, and staring down a massive Soviet threat to the north of Iran. Nixon was desperate. He needed a strong, reliable ally to hold the line in the Persian Gulf. And as scholar Roham Avandi argues, this completely flips the traditional narrative on its head. It actually reveals the Shah as a master manipulator of Washington, a leader who transformed Iran from a mere client state into an indispensable and highly demanding partner of the United States. Keep this dynamic in the back of your mind as we explore exactly how he built his power.
Let's dive into our first section, Consolidating the Autocratic State.
So, how did the Shah fundamentally rebuild his state after returning from exile following the CIA and MI6-backed coup of 1953? Well, his governing philosophy was driven by a single, borderline paranoid imperative. He was determined to never ever let a situation like the Mossadegh crisis happen again. Historian Ervind Abrahamian explains that the Shah restarted, at full speed, the drive to expand the three main pillars holding up his state. First up, the military. The budget for the military grew 12-fold between 1954 and 1977. That allowed the Shah to buy ultra-sophisticated weaponry. We're talking fleets of hovercrafts and advanced fighter jets that completely outclassed almost anything else in the region. Second, he built a sprawling bureaucracy that expanded to over 300,000 civil servants, reaching deep into rural districts to manage everyday life. And third, an extensive court patronage system, anchored by the tax-exempt Pahlavi salvation. Now, this foundation functioned essentially as a shadow government. It siphoned off vast amounts of oil revenues and controlled billions in national assets, from hotels to cement factories. Together, these three pillars gave the Shah unprecedented, suffocating control over Iranian society.
But, as scholar Ray Tehe notes, this huge state expansion brought with it severe repression, and that was epitomized by the creation of SAVAK in 1957. With technical assistance and training from the US CIA and the Israeli Mossad, SAVAK grew into a massive, terrifying surveillance apparatus. Its creation really signaled a turning point where the regime began equating almost any political dissent with treason. It decimated opposition groups like the Tudeh Party, but beyond just arresting activists, SAVAK inflicted a deep psychological toll on Iranian society. It created this pervasive, paralyzing paranoia where people literally feared that their neighbors, their colleagues, or even their students might be informants. The entire country fell under a heavy blanket of intense fear and censorship.
Moving on to our next theme, the White Revolution.
Having secured his power apparatus and neutralized his immediate political threats, the Shah embarked on an incredibly ambitious program of social transformation in the early 1960s. The centerpiece of this transformation was the White Revolution, which was officially launched in 1963. Now, this was explicitly designed as a top-down reform program. Why? Because the Shah was absolutely terrified of Soviet-backed communist uprisings, what he called a Red Revolution. So this whole thing was essentially a Cold War survival tactic, preemptive reform from the top to prevent a violent uprising from the bottom. And while it definitely included progressive elements, things like women's suffrage and a literacy core, its absolute core was land reform. The ultimate goal was to break the historic power of rural notables and landlords and bring the peasantry directly under the control of the central government.
The regime heavily promoted these reforms through a massive propaganda campaign. They issued commemorative stamps celebrating mechanization, health, education, and the distribution of land. The propaganda explicitly cast the Shah as this progressive, benevolent modernizer reaching out directly to the rural masses. It was a highly calculated effort to totally bypass traditional political and religious structures, presenting the monarchy as the one and only engine of Iranian progress and prosperity.
However, let's take a look at the reality versus the rhetoric here. Historians Nikki Keddie and Ervan Abrahamian argue that while the land reform successfully broke the old landlords, it functioned primarily as a tool of political control, not social justice. The law was just absolutely full of glaring loopholes. Landlords routinely evaded redistribution by transferring deeds to their relatives, converting their holdings into mechanized farms, or honestly simply bribing local officials. Ultimately, it enriched a new class of commercial farmers while deeply, deeply frustrating the peasantry. The very people the revolution claimed to help quickly realized it was entirely hollow. The vast majority of peasants were left either completely landless or with plots way too small to actually survive on.
Now, let's look at Section 3, the Petroleum Rentier State.
To fund his massive state apparatus, that bloated military, and these super ambitious domestic programs, the Shah relied heavily on a single resource that would fundamentally alter Iran's economy and society. Driven by skyrocketing oil wealth, Iran transformed into a true rentier state. Abrahamian notes that the government relied heavily on foreign exchange from petroleum rather than domestic taxation. Now, why does this matter? Well, it flips a foundational principle of political science. We've all heard the phrase, no taxation without representation. But the inverse is also true. If a state doesn't need to tax its citizens, it becomes entirely insulated from them. It doesn't need their political consent anymore, just their compliance. The Shah became the sole distributor of this massive national wealth, completely detached from the economic realities of everyday Iranians. The sheer scale of this petroleum boom was staggering. Abrahamian's data shows the explosive growth of this wealth, jumping from just $34.4 million in 1954 to an unbelievable $18 billion by 1974. As Tehi points out, this financial tsunami was largely fueled by the Shah's aggressive push to quadruple global oil prices during the 1973 OPEC crisis. The Shah masterminded this move, totally turning the tables on Western oil giants and forcing them to pay a premium. The money poured into the country vastly faster than the Iranian economy, infrastructure, or institutions could possibly absorb it, triggering massive inflation and huge economic bottlenecks.
Next up, social tensions and inequality.
Well, the macroeconomic numbers look spectacular on paper. I mean, incredible GDP growth and rapid industrialization. The state's economic strategy was quietly generating severe, explosive social ruptures just beneath the surface. Abrahamian maps out a highly complex and polarized class structure during this era. At the very top, a tiny 0.1% elite, the royal family, senior officers, and court-connected entrepreneurs, monopolize the immense new wealth. Meanwhile, the lower classes swelled to encompass nearly 80% of the population. Remember that failed land reform we talked about? Well, it drove millions of displaced, landless peasants out of the countryside and straight into rapidly expanding urban shantytowns. These areas had no running water, no electricity, and no paved roads. It created a massive, incredibly angry urban working class sitting right on the doorstep of the opulent capital, completely neglected by the state's modernization projects.
And the math totally confirms this widening inequality. Frankly, the numbers are shocking. The regime relied heavily on a trickle-down economic theory, but the wealth solidly stuck right at the top. Central bank data on urban household expenditure reveals that during the massive oil boom of the early 70s, the richest tenth of the population consumed even more of the nation's wealth, growing from 35.3% to nearly 38%. Meanwhile, the poorest decile actually lost ground, shrinking from 1.7% to 1.3%. Really think about that for a second. During the greatest economic boom in Iran's history, the poorest 10% of the country actually grew poorer. So the crucial point here is how these shifting demographics reacted to the disparity. Keddie and Abrahamian point out that these economic disparities, combined with the systematic political repression by SAVAK, deeply radicalized the modern middle class, the students, the engineers, the professionals. And simultaneously, the regime managed to completely alienate the traditional middle class, the bazaris. You see, to fight the inflation caused by his own oil boom, the Shah sent anti-profiteering squads into the bazaars, unfairly fining and arresting traditional merchants. This was a disastrous policy. It pushed the powerful merchant class directly into a revolutionary alliance with the clergy. By the late 1970s, the Shah had managed to isolate himself from almost every single major segment of Iranian society. Finally, let's move to our last section, the Nixon Doctrine.
Meanwhile, as domestic tensions simmered and the base of his support narrowed dangerously, the Shah used his unprecedented oil wealth to pursue his ultimate foreign policy goal, making Iran the undisputed regional hegemon. This ambition perfectly dovetailed with the Nixon Doctrine. As scholar Roham Alvandi explains, this doctrine emerged from two major geopolitical shifts. First, Britain's sudden military withdrawal from east of Suez in 1971 left a massive power vacuum in the Persian Gulf. Second, following the trauma of the Vietnam War, the American public had absolutely no appetite for new foreign military entanglements. Therefore, the Nixon Doctrine was a strategy to rely on heavily armed regional allies to act as local policemen. The idea was they would maintain security and stability in their respective spheres without requiring direct U.S. troop deployments.
And this is where the dynamic truly shifts in Iran's favor. Scholar Roham Alvandi argues that rather than being a subservient American client, the Shah actively manipulated President Nixon and Henry Kissinger. He leveraged their distraction with Vietnam and the Soviet Union and brilliantly used the framework of the Nixon Doctrine to tilt U.S. policy exclusively toward Tehran. Previously, the U.S. had tried to balance power between Iran and Saudi Arabia in a twin pillars approach. Well, the Shah convinced Washington to effectively abandon that balance and rely entirely on Iran as the single dominant pillar of Gulf security. It was a massive diplomatic triumph for him.
Armed with Nixon's Protect Me mandate, the Shah was given a literal blank check to purchase massive quantities of the most sophisticated non-nuclear weapons in the U.S. arsenal. By 1978, he had placed orders for a staggering $12 billion in arms, including advanced F-14 and F-16 fighter jets and naval destroyers. Furthermore, as Takei details, the Shah initiated a vast nuclear energy program. He created an atomic energy agency and planned to build 20 nuclear reactors by 1994. And in a striking historical irony, Washington actively encouraged Iran's pursuit of these nuclear reactors. They didn't view it as a proliferation threat at all, but rather as a highly lucrative business opportunity for American energy firms.
As we wrap up this explainer, we really must ask ourselves a profound historical question. How did the Shah's absolute success in consolidating state power, amassing unprecedented wealth, and manipulating foreign superpowers ultimately engineer his own domestic collapse? Think about it. He built an invincible military and a pervasive security state, yet his failure to distribute wealth equitably, his destruction of legitimate political participation, and his alienation of traditional classes created the very social isolation that allowed a massive, cross-class revolution to sweep his dynasty into the dustbin of history. It's a fascinating and ultimately tragic paradox of absolute power. Thank you for joining me for this analysis.